Hi guys, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking a little bit more about the content in the chapters that you read this week on narration and description. That's kind of the first two modes of writing that we're going to cover in the class. So first I want to talk about narrative, I want to talk about descriptive writing. I want to go into some more ideas that our textbook and these slides cover, but not thoroughly. What is narrative writing? Well, you guys have already done this at this point. Your first essay was really a personal narrative. It was a story about you. In some cases, you kind of described yourselves. Maybe some of you told specific stories or instances, and there was sort of like a beginning, a middle, and an end to each one of those stories. So a lot of your first essay included both of these elements. Specifically, and really kind of most importantly, narratives are stories that paint a picture of a specific scenario. And of course, if you read a lot, if you've ever read anything storybook related, you've read a narrative. I'm sure that really you are exposed to narratives all the time. You watch a movie, you watch television, you read a book, you read a story, all of that stuff is narrative. You tell your friends about what happened to you at the mall yesterday or whatever. All that stuff is narrative, but how do we write it and how do we make it an academic essay? So no matter what, narrative writing has to include these concepts here. There's got to be a plot, so there's got to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there is, regarding plot, there's what we call the narrative arc in a very basic form. You begin with exposition, where you're kind of setting the scene. Then there's rising action. There's the climax, where the conflict is building, conflict is rising, and then you're kind of at this tipping point where conflict can't get any bigger. Something has to change, some kind of pivotal moment within the story, something has to happen. In some stories this can be really big, and some stories this can be really small. So something has to happen here, and then the rest of the story kind of falls back into line. There is either, everything goes back to the normal order, or a new normal order is established, and there is a resolution after that. So there's got to be a plot, there's got to be conflict, even, again, if it's big conflict or little conflict. It can be conflict between two parties. It can be internal conflict. A lot of personal writing writes about internal conflict. There are characters. There might just be one character in your personal narratives. Maybe you just wrote about yourselves, although you probably wrote about other people or bodies, maybe animals that are in your lives. There's got to be a setting, a time, a place, a location, the time of day, the time of year, what century are we in, things like that. I'm going to come back to theme. There's a point of view. First person point of view is something like, I did this, I did that, where you're talking specifically about yourself, and you can only kind of see the events as they unfold through your eyes. There's also third person point of view. You're talking about what someone else is doing. There's different types of third person point of view. There's omniscient or limited. For example, limited would be you're telling a story about someone else and you can only see the events through their eyes. Or omniscient, you're telling a story about someone else and other people are involved and you can experience the story from everyone's lives. And we're really kind of getting into, a lot of creative writing here. There's sequence, right? If there's a plot, first this happens, then this happens, this other thing happens. And some writers will experiment with putting things out of sequence, but there is still a sequence, and there are transitions. Again, first, next, last, things like that. Getting back to theme, really, I think theme is what speaks to academic writing in terms of narrative. So if you're writing an essay and you are telling a story, there's got to be a point, right? No matter what essay, like we talked about last week, no matter what essay you're writing, there needs to be a thesis statement. You need to have a main idea, and the theme of your story can help to identify that main idea and help your reader kind of solidify that main idea for your story. So thinking about all of this, what types of stories serve for academic essays? Well, I feel like the best ones is when you're using stories as an example of something. You're making an argument, or you're making a claim, you're making a statement, and the best way to prove that to be true or to explain your ideas is to tell stories. Stories, I think, help to kind of take maybe abstract concepts and put them into specific, manageable chunks for your reader, things that they can best understand. So, imagine a time when you've tried to explain something to someone and they're confused, that's not working, so you're like, okay, well, maybe if I turn this into a story, it will make more sense. And that story can be emotion-based, it can be logic-based, it can be based on whatever it is that you have to tell in order to kind of support your ideas. Now, for the essay that you're going to be writing, I'm not necessarily interested in a first-person narrative. So what you would have to do for your brainstorm and your thesis statement and things like that, if you were to explore a story, would be to write about someone else. So if you do decide to incorporate narration into your essay, or specifically write a narrative essay, I want your narrative to be about someone else. You can talk about someone else's struggles, someone else's joys, someone else's triumphs, someone else's experiences. Again, all to support a main idea. And that's kind of the theme and what it is that you're trying to figure out. So again, you have seen examples of narratives. These are novels, short stories, biographies, autobiographies, historical accounts. Poems can be narratives, and of course dramas and plays. And if you've ever taken literature or studied lit in any way, you can think about kind of how people analyze theme in order to make arguments. Academic essays that are primarily narratives do the same thing. It's just that they make their argument more clear. If you've ever read a text, maybe in class, and your teacher's like, oh, well, this narrative means X, Y, and Z, and you're like, well, are you sure that it means that? Are you sure you're not reading too much into it? An academic essay that uses narration to support its ideas is going to clearly state why those stories are being present to support those ideas. So there's not so much of a question of like, is my teacher a bit loony and reading too much into something? Okay, a narrative writing and descriptive writing often comes hand in hand. I mean, think about it this way. If you have to describe characters, if you have to describe a plot, if you have to describe a setting, you need to use descriptive details, right? And so description is something where you're tapping into those five senses. You're describing nouns, people, places, things, experiences. You can describe abstract concepts, right? Love is still a noun, but it's an abstract concept. So descriptive writing is something where you are describing something. There's small elements of descriptive writing and narration, which is why we talk about these two things hand in hand. But there can also be essays that are just devoted to descriptive writing. We're talking about sensory language, something that taps into our five senses, which we're going to get into, I think, in the next slide. Vivid detail, figurative language, and just kind of this concept of showing instead of telling. So what that means is, like, instead of saying that I was afraid, I would say my hands were sweaty, I was shaking, I had fear in my eyes, my legs felt like they wanted to get up and run away, and that would show my fear as opposed to just straight up saying I was afraid. So just allowing your reader to kind of experience your writing firsthand by making it so vividly descriptive that they can't help but feel the things that the author is describing. Again, most writing literature uses description, and it's something that has its place in academic writing. So what I want to talk about is just this concept of the difference between subjective description and objective description. And I'm kind of like going away from this slide for just a second, but subjective description is description that's based on whoever is telling that story or whoever is describing something, it's their experiences. Think about a car accident where there's two drivers involved and both of them say it was the other driver's fault. And so they describe to the police officer what happened. Well, those are both subjective because driver number one experienced it in this way and driver number two experienced it separately. They are going based on how they felt in the moment. They're going based on what they think they saw, what they think they saw being the key phrase, I think. So there is subjective and subjectivity in description. More academic writing that relies on a lot of heavy description apart from narration is going to be based on objective description. And so if there's a reason for you to describe something, and you'll see this in the example that we read for the week on the Taj Mahal, you'll see that kind of like, well, there's some subjective description, certainly, but there's also objective description in that anyone looking at something would describe it in the same way. For example, if I had to describe the cup sitting next to me, I could measure its height, I could find the circumference of the cup, I could say exactly how much water it holds, and that would all be objective description. And so there's going to be times where there is a need for objective description in order to clearly communicate something to a reader. And there are going to be essays, particularly maybe like scientific essays, where objective description is required. And most writing includes a blend of both objective and subjective description. And that's perfectly fine. Whenever you are describing, though, don't forget to think about all of your five senses. And some of these might not apply. For example, if I am going to talk about this cup that's next to me, I may or may not want to taste the actual cup. I mean, of course I'm drinking out of it, so there's something happening there. I may or may not be able to describe the sound of the cup, although I could like flick it or pour water into it, and there's certainly some auditory sensory details that I could pull out, but just don't forget about that thing you learned a long time ago, which is the five senses. So your sight, or what you see, what something looks like, the sound, what you hear, taste, smell, and then touch. Like, what does it feel like? You know, is it plastic? Is it glass? Is it cloth? Is it smooth or silky or bumpy or rubbery or whatever? The example that's given here is really descriptive. The acid smell penetrated my nostrils as I breathed deeply. The humidity after the rain clung to my skin as I walked to my crippled car. Okay, so we can see that there's a lot of kind of like sensory details. And again, the goal is to get your reader to experience what you are experiencing. Sensory language and a lot of storytelling works really well when you want your reader to feel how you feel, or to feel how someone else has felt. Then it works really, really well with appeals to the heart, and kind of like appeals to what we'll eventually at some point get into, this concept of pathos, where you want your reader to have an emotional connection with your subject matter, and so you're going to put them into that moment and make them feel the things that you're going to feel. So I want you to be thinking about all of this narration and description as you start brainstorming, and kind of think about like what topics would be best to use storytelling and to use description to support your ideas. And as you're doing that, your whole essay doesn't have to be a story. Your whole essay doesn't have to purely function off of a description, but those should be major elements as you're kind of coming up with a thesis statement and brainstorming for those. So if you're struggling, or if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate, send me an email, and we can talk more about narration and description. And then of course, refer to the chapters in your textbook.